Silas "Snake" Miller ruined his life with 3 big blunders. His first error happened in 1939 when he was just 18. Living in Savannah, Georgia, he felt bitter and lost. He decided to join a local hate group that promised him power, but they only filled his head with lies and hate. His second disaster took place in the summer of 1947 near Jackson, Mississippi. Silas was moving illegal whiskey when a highway patrolman named Leo Vance flagged him down. Terrified of going back to a cell, Silas lost his mind and shot the officer twice in the heart. The law tracked him down in less than a week. A jury sent him to death row, giving him a date with the electric chair. At 26, he was a dead man walking. However, it was his third mistake that truly sealed his fate. On March 14, 1948, Silas was a fugitive. He had broken out of custody a few days prior and was starving and frantic. He stumbled into a high-end boutique in the middle of Harlem. He spotted a classy woman standing by herself and thought she would be a soft target. He flashed his pistol and barked at her to hand over the cash or lose her life. The woman didn't flinch. She looked at him with a cold kind of pity and warned him that he had just signed his own death warrant. That woman was Bumpy Johnson's wife. In less than 5 hours, Bumpy would arrive at that shop carrying a sharp blade to show Silas exactly what happened to men who threatened his family. The press labeled the aftermath a fight for survival. The neighborhood called it a reckoning. Silas couldn't call it anything at all. That morning, Silas had been a free man for less than a week. He had slipped away during a chaotic jailbreak while guards were busy breaking up a staged riot on a transport truck. Out of the 3 guys who ran, Silas was the only one who didn't get caught immediately. He made it to the Big Apple with nothing but $5, a jacket he swiped from a deputy, and a desperate urge to stay hidden. He spent 6 days hopping onto cargo trains and hitching rides with strangers, sleeping in dusty barns just to stay out of sight. For nearly a week, Silas went without a real meal. He survived by pilfering whatever he could find, drowning his fear in rotgut bourbon to silence the nagging voice telling him he was a walking corpse. By the time he collapsed onto a bench at Grand Central Terminal on the evening of March 13, he was a wreck, covered in grime, intoxicated, and pushed to the brink. He was a stranger to the North. Before this, he had never stepped past the borders of Tennessee. The massive scale of New York terrified him. The crowds were too thick, the sirens too loud, and the skyscrapers felt like they were leaning in to crush him. His plan was simple but expensive: steal at least $600 to buy a ticket to Montreal. He figured he could vanish in Canada, reinventing himself where the Mississippi executioner couldn't find him. After a freezing night huddled in a subway tunnel, Silas woke up trembling and desperate for a fix. He began hunting for a soft target, a shop with plenty of cash where he could strike and vanish. But Silas was hopeless with a map. He tried to find the high-end shops of Fifth Avenue but ended up on the wrong train. He hopped off at a busy stop in the heart of the community, suddenly realizing he was the only white face for blocks. Every business, every sign, and every person on the sidewalk belonged to a world he had been taught to hate and fear. His instincts screamed at him to run back to the station. This was hostile ground. But then, his eyes landed on a boutique that looked like it was printing money. The displays were elegant, featuring high-fashion gowns that clearly cost a fortune. His prejudiced mind, poisoned by years of hateful rhetoric, convinced him this was his lucky break. He assumed that a business owned by people he considered inferior would be defenseless. He believed the women inside would crumble the moment they saw his weapon. He was leaning on a lifetime of lies, and he was about to pay the ultimate price for that arrogance. In 1948, Bumpy Johnson's wife was 40 years old and as tough as the city itself. Originally from the rural South, she had moved to the city during the 1930s. She had spent years working as a tailor, perfecting her craft before opening this very shop 4 years prior with capital Bumpy had given her to build her own empire. That boutique was more than just a place of commerce, it was her personal sanctuary. Inside those walls, she wasn't just the wife of the city's most feared man, she was a self-made professional and a pillar of the neighborhood. On that particular morning, the store was silent. Her helper was running late, and the usual flow of shoppers didn't typically start until closer to noon. She was in the rear office, meticulously counting her stock and updating her records. Her handwriting was neat and focused, a skill she had worked hard to master later in life. The chime of the bell at the entrance broke her concentration. She looked up, assuming her employee had finally arrived. Instead, she saw a disheveled man in a grimy, oversized coat. He looked like a cornered animal, frantic, sweaty, and exhausted. His hand was buried deep in his pocket, a posture she knew all too well. Having spent over a decade by Bumpy's side, she could spot a man about to pull a trigger from a mile away. Silas marched toward the back of the shop. He saw a refined, solitary woman and figured he had hit the jackpot. He drew his weapon, a heavy, rusted military pistol he had swiped from a pawnshop in Pennsylvania. The gun was a relic, likely jammed with grit and age, but Silas only cared that it looked lethal. His fingers were trembling from the lack of whiskey, yet the barrel was pointed straight at her. "Clean out the cash box," Silas growled, his voice sounding like broken glass. "Do it fast, or I'll end you right here." She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the money, and she certainly didn't cry out. She simply stared at him with a look that confused him. It wasn't the terror he was hunting for, it was a cold, distant sympathy. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" she asked softly. Her tone was as flat and calm as if she were asking for the time. "Give me the money," Silas yelled, his voice cracking. He was used to the power the gun gave him, but this woman was treating him like a nuisance rather than a threat. "I can hear you just fine," she replied, staying perfectly still. "I'm just trying to figure out if you realize how lost you actually are." Silas felt his temper flare. "I know where You're in the heart of Harlem," she cut him off. "You're on a main strip, inside my business, and you've pointed a weapon at me." She leaned in slightly. "Do you have any idea whose face you're looking at?" Silas had no clue, and that void in his knowledge was a death sentence. "I don't give a damn who you are," he spat, moving closer and leveling the gun at her forehead. "You're about to be a corpse." "My name is Bumpy Johnson's wife," she said firmly. Does that name ring a bell? It meant nothing to him. Silas had spent his recent months behind bars. Before that, his world was limited to the backwoods of the Deep South, hauling illegal liquor through the pines. He was a complete stranger to the power structures of Upper Manhattan. He had no clue which names held weight or which people truly owned these streets. He didn't grasp the gravity of what she was saying. "I don't give a lick about your name," he snarled. "Hand over the cash right now, or I promise I'll." That was when she spoke the 5 words that should have sent him sprinting for the exit. "You just made a terrible mistake." Her tone remained perfectly level. She didn't shout or growl. She stated it as a cold, hard reality, the same way one might tell a stranger they had a flat tire. It was a simple observation of a looming disaster. Silas let out a jagged, anxious laugh that betrayed his own mounting dread. "Oh yeah. What kind of mistake is that?" She studied him in silence for a few seconds. Then, instead of cowering, she walked right past him. She didn't run. She moved with a chilling grace toward the entrance. She flipped the sign from open to closed, turned the deadbolt, and pulled the blinds shut, plunging the shop into a dim, private light. Silas stood there, completely baffled. "What do you think you're doing?" he stammered. "Giving you a head start," she replied flatly. "You have maybe a few hours. After that, your fate is out of my hands." She stepped behind the counter to the telephone and began to dial. Silas had his chance to intervene, but her total lack of fear paralyzed him. He watched, frozen, as she waited for someone to answer on the other end. "It's me," she said into the receiver. "Send a message that the garden needs tending. I've shut the store for the day." She replaced the handset and turned her gaze back to Silas, who was looking at her as if she had completely snapped. What was that supposed to be? Silas barked. Who was on the phone? "A lounge called the Savoy," she answered. "It's a few blocks away. I just sent word to my husband." A sudden chill crawled up Silas's spine. "Your husband? Ellsworth Johnson," she said, watching for any sign of recognition. Though most folks around here just call him Bumpy. The name meant nothing to the man from the South. He had no clue he was standing in front of the wife of the most feared kingpin in the city. He didn't realize that across every square inch of these streets, there were 3 unbreakable laws. Rule number 1, never rob Bumpy's associates. Rule number 2, never challenge Bumpy's authority. Rule number 3, the most important one of all, never, under any circumstances, lay a hand on Bumpy's wife. Silas had just shattered the 3rd rule, and the clock was ticking. "I couldn't care less who your man is," Silas blurted out, trying to mask his trembling voice with bravado. "If he sticks his nose in here, I'll put a hole in him, too. Now, the cash. Hand it over." "Or what?" she challenged him. "You'll pull the trigger? And then? Do you honestly believe you'll breathe another breath of fresh air once you step outside? Do you think this neighborhood will just stand by?" Silas lunged forward, gripping her arm with enough force to leave dark marks. "Look here, woman, I've ended lives before. One more won't haunt me. Your husband is just another." The wail of sirens cut him off. Silas's head jerked toward the storefront. Peering through a sliver in the blinds, he saw a fleet of patrol cars screech to a halt. 6 officers piled out, unholstering their service revolvers and taking cover behind their doors. "You tipped off the law," Silas shrieked, his panic hitting a fever pitch. "I didn't have to," she replied calmly. "People in Harlem watch over one another. Someone saw you come in here, looking for trouble." The next few hours were a blur of terror for Silas. The shop was completely boxed in. A specialist arrived to try and talk him down, shouting through the locked entrance to get a dialogue started. Silas hauled her to the front window, shoving the cold barrel of the pistol against her temple. He screamed that he'd execute her the moment a blue uniform crossed the threshold. But the real terror wasn't the police, it was the street. By midday, a crowd of about 200 had materialized on the avenue. It wasn't a chaotic riot, it was a wall of humanity. There were moms holding their toddlers, elderly gentlemen in their Sunday best, laborers in stained overalls, and shopkeepers who had locked their own doors to stand vigil. They packed the pavement, forming a human barrier between the cops and the boutique. They weren't throwing stones or shouting threats, they were simply there. The police tried to push them back, following their usual protocols to secure a crime scene. "Move it along, folks," a sergeant barked through a megaphone. "This is a dangerous hostage crisis. You're blocking our path." An old woman at the front of the line, clutching a Bible and wearing a wide-brimmed hat, looked at the officer with pure defiance. "We aren't in your way, son," she said. "We are here to bear witness." "Ma'am, I am giving you a direct order to." "This is our home," a man in a blood-stained butcher's apron shouted back, cutting the officer off. "That's the Queen of Harlem in that building," the butcher added. "We're staying put until she walks out unharmed." As the tension escalated, more cruisers arrived. Captain Robert Sterling pulled up, assessed the sea of people, and immediately realized he couldn't use muscle to solve this. You can't cuff 200 neighbors without sparking a full-blown uprising. Sterling had patrolled these streets for years and knew exactly how the local power grid functioned. He was on Bumpy Johnson's payroll, nothing major, just enough to avert his eyes from the numbers runners or drop a hint before a scheduled sweep. It was the cost of doing business, and Sterling accepted it because Bumpy maintained a level of order the police never could. Under Bumpy's watch, the chaos was kept at a minimum. But this standoff was a powder keg. Inside the boutique, Silas was falling apart. The walls were closing in, and the weight of his predicament was crushing him. He was trapped with a hostage and surrounded by law enforcement. Yet, the woman remained unervingly composed. She wasn't sobbing or pleading for her life. She was simply biding her time, as if she were privy to a secret Silas couldn't grasp. "Why aren't you terrified?" Silas finally blurted out around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They had been trapped for 4 long hours. She met his gaze. "Because the conclusion to this story is already written," she said. The only variable is whether you're bright enough to give up before my husband arrives. I told you, I don't give a damn about. You really should. She cut him off. Bumpy Johnson runs this entire district. He has buried men for much smaller insults than this. And you laid hands on his wife and threatened her life on his home turf. She took a beat. Let that reality settle in. Silas Miller, right? That's what the talker outside called you. An escaped murderer from Mississippi, already marked for the chair. Silas's jaw dropped. How did you? The man at the door told me, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. He thought it would help me talk sense into you. Silas, you're already living on borrowed time. Mississippi wants to fry you. You think you have nothing to lose because you're already a dead man. Silas remained silent, his face twitching. But here is what you're missing, she continued softly. There are many ways to leave this world. The electric chair is fast. A few thousand volts and your heart stops instantly. But my husband, he doesn't believe in fast. He is a man of great patience and dark imagination. If you leave another mark on me, he will ensure your final moments are far more agonizing than anything the state of Mississippi could ever dream up. You're just trying to scare me, Silas hissed. Am I? She asked, her eyes never leaving his. Do you really want to gamble on that? She asked. At 3:42 p.m., the shop's telephone began to wail. Silas flinched, staring at the device as if it were a bomb. Don't you dare touch that, he warned. That's likely the man in charge outside, she said calmly. You ought to pick it up. Listen to what he has to say. Keeping his weapon trained on her, Silas reached out and snatched the receiver. What do you want? Miller, this is Captain Sterling, the voice on the other end said. How is the lady doing? She's still breathing, Silas snapped. And she'll stay that way only if you get me a vehicle and a clear path to the border. No tricks. I can't grant you that, Miller. Then her blood is on your hands. Silas, listen to me very carefully. Sterling's voice dropped, becoming low and deadly serious. You need to release that woman this second. Not because I'm telling you to, but because her husband just pulled up. Silas felt a wave of cold nausea hit him. What? Bumpy Johnson is here. He is standing right outside your door, Sterling continued. I've been on this beat for 15 years, Silas. I have seen the wreckage this man leaves behind when someone disrespects him. You're already a dead man in Mississippi. Don't make your final hours a living hell. Give up. Let us take you back to the South. At least that way, your end is quick. You're lying to me, Silas hissed. See for yourself. Look out the window. Silas shuffled toward the blinds, dragging the woman with him, the pistol still jammed against her temple. He peered through the small opening. The massive crowd of 200 people had split perfectly down the center, forming a long, silent aisle leading straight to the boutique. Walking slowly down that path was Bumpy Johnson. He was 45 years old and stood at average height, but he moved with such absolute authority that he looked like a giant. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit and a crisp hat, his shoes gleaming in the afternoon sun. He looked like a high-level executive on his way to a board meeting, but his eyes told a different story. Silas recognized that look. It was the gaze of a predator who had ended so many lives that he no longer felt anything at all. It was as cold and vacant as a shark's. Bumpy stopped 10 feet from the entrance. He reached into his blazer, and every police officer on the scene gripped their holsters. But Bumpy didn't pull a gun. He produced a classic straight razor, the kind with a bone handle and a blade that could either give a clean shave or end a life in a heartbeat. With a snap of his wrist, he flicked the blade open. Click. That sound echoed across the frozen street, a sharp, metallic snap that felt as final as a closing coffin lid. Bumpy fixed his eyes directly on the window where he knew Silas was hiding. Then, he shifted his gaze to Captain Sterling. His voice wasn't loud, but the absolute silence of the neighborhood made his words carry to every ear on the block. Captain, I'm going to offer you a piece of professional advice, Bumpy said. In roughly 2 minutes, I am entering that shop. What occurs once I step inside is not something you want your boys to see. You don't want them filling out those reports, and you certainly don't want them taking the stand to describe it later. Mr. Johnson, this is an official police scene, Sterling stammered. I can't just. You can. Bumpy cut him off, his voice chillingly steady. You can instruct your officers to keep the perimeter but stay exactly where they are. Tell them if they hear a disturbance, they are to wait 30 seconds before moving in. 30 seconds, Captain. That is all the time I require. Johnson, if I allow this. You aren't allowing a thing. Bumpy's eyes bored into Sterling's. I am informing you of the reality of the situation. You can have your men standing over my shoulder, and they'll be trapped in internal investigations and paperwork for the next 2 years. Or, you can be a smart man. Keep them back. Let me settle my private affairs. When I'm finished, Silas Miller will be breathing and ready for his trip back to Mississippi. Everyone gets what they want. Sterling looked at the 200 pairs of eyes watching him from the sidewalk. He made a split-second decision based on survival rather than the badge. All units. Sterling shouted, his voice strained. Withdraw to the end of the street. Keep your eyes on the structure, but do not move in unless I personally give the word. Captain, we shouldn't. That's a direct order. The officers backed away slowly, their faces full of hesitation. They weren't gone, but they were far enough away to provide plausible deniability. Far enough to say they hadn't actually witnessed the justice that was about to be served. The crowd, however, didn't budge an inch. Bumpy walked up to the boutique door and rattled the handle. Locked. He stepped back and called out toward the shaded window, his voice almost casual. Silas, you have 2 paths in front of you, Bumpy announced. Path number 1, you unlock this door this instant. You let my wife walk out without a single scratch or bruise. If you do that, I will step aside and let Captain Sterling take you into custody. You'll go back to the South, and they'll put you in the chair. It'll be over in a flash. No pain, no lingering. Bumpy let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. Path number 2, I break this door down. And before you ever see Mississippi again, you're going to spend a long time in a local ward wishing you had picked the first option. The surgeons there will work very hard to keep your heart beating, but you will spend every agonizing second of that time learning exactly what happens to men who break the laws of this neighborhood. Inside the store, Silas was coming apart. The heavy pistol in his hand was jumping with the rhythm of his racing heart. He's just talking big, Silas muttered to Bumpy's wife, his voice cracking. He won't. There's no way he can just. He isn't lying to you, she replied in a low, steady voice. And Silas, think about your reality. You are already a dead man. Mississippi is going to send you to that chair whether you give up now or a week from today. The only thing you can control is the amount of pain you feel before you go. Release me. Take the quick path. Please. Silas stared at her, then at the heavy door, then down at the iron in his grip. He thought back to those hateful meetings in Georgia, where they bragged about being the masters of the world and using terror to keep people down. He remembered being told how easy it was to break people like her. He realized in that moment that every single thing he had been taught was a lie that had led him to this slaughterhouse. I won't go back, Silas choked out. I can't face that chair. You don't have a choice about where you're going, she said. But you have a choice about whether you go there in one piece. That is the only deal on the table. Outside, Bumpy's patience evaporated. He took 3 deliberate steps back from the entrance. Then, with an explosive burst of energy, he charged and drove his heel into the frame right beside the latch. The door didn't just open, it shattered. Wood splinters sprayed into the air as the locking mechanism was torn from the wall. Silas whirled toward the crash, trying to level his pistol at the gap. Bumpy was already through, moving with a terrifying, fluid speed that defied his age. The silver blade was out, catching the faint light filtering through the blinds. No. Silas shrieked, squeezing the trigger. Click. The neglected military sidearm, the one Silas had stolen and never bothered to oil or inspect, betrayed him. The slide jammed halfway, a casing caught in the port like a bone in a throat. Silas stared at the junk in his hand for a single, paralyzed heartbeat. That was all the time Bumpy needed. Bumpy bridged the gap in 2 lunges. His left hand flashed forward like a whip, catching Silas's wrist and wrenching it with such savage force that Silas's bones groaned. The useless gun hit the floor with a heavy thud. Then, Bumpy's right hand, the one wielding the razor, rose in a blur of motion. What followed lasted less than 8 seconds, but the story would be whispered in every corner of Harlem for the next 7 decades. Bumpy slammed Silas against the wall, pinning him there with a hand of iron. The razor moved with the terrifying accuracy of a master craftsman, carving a thin, perfectly straight line across Silas's neck. It wasn't deep enough to hit the artery or end his life. It was a shallow, agonizing reminder. It was a message written in blood. A single sharp line was drawn from the left side of Silas's jaw all the way across to the right. It sat about 2 inches under his chin, deep enough to send a torrent of blood down his shirt, deep enough to burn like liquid fire, and deep enough to leave a mark he would carry to his grave. But it wasn't a killing blow. "That's for laying your filthy hands on my wife," Bumpy said in a low, even tone. He sounded like a teacher calmly correcting a student who had failed a simple test. Silas collapsed against the wall, his hands flailing to his neck. Hot, thick blood leaked through his fingers, staining his palms. His heart hammered against his hands as he tried to keep his life from pouring out. His eyes were huge, filled with a mixture of pure shock and agonizing pain. Bumpy didn't even look hurried. He stepped back, wiped the crimson from the blade onto Silas's stolen coat, and snapped the razor shut with a flick of his wrist before sliding it away. He turned his back on the bleeding man and looked at his wife. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she replied. Bumpy turned back to Silas, who had slumped into a sitting position on the floor. Both of Silas's hands were clamped over the wound, his eyes locked onto Bumpy with the raw terror of a cornered beast. "Silas!" Bumpy's voice remained soft. "Look at me." The man looked up, blood slicking his arms and dripping onto the hardwood floor. "You arrived here today thinking you found a soft target," Bumpy said. "You got turned around, ended up in a place you don't know, and thought you could just take what you wanted because you had a weapon and she didn't. You believed every lie your group told you about being better than us. You thought your hate made you untouchable." Bumpy knelt down, bringing his face level with the trembling fugitive. "You were wrong about every single thing. That mark on your throat is your final lesson. You're going to carry that memory for the few days you have left. You'll remember the day you learned that hate doesn't protect you. A pistol isn't real power. And you'll remember that some women have husbands who will walk through a wall of police to keep them safe." Bumpy stood up, walked to the shattered doorway, and called out to the sidewalk. "Captain Sterling, Miller is ready to go. He's going to need a doctor. He's got a cut on his neck, it's not deep, but he's losing a fair amount of blood. He'll survive long enough to face the chair in Mississippi." Sterling stepped into the shop, followed by 2 of his men. They stared at Silas bleeding on the floor, then at Bumpy, who looked perfectly composed. They saw the jammed gun discarded in the corner. Sterling's gaze shifted to a heavy brass letter opener sitting on the desk, a decorative piece shaped like a small blade that she used for her mail. "What exactly took place in here, Mr. Johnson?" Sterling asked. "Miller tried to lunge at my wife with that letter opener the second I broke through the door," Bumpy replied, pointing toward the desk. "I had to take him down," Bumpy added calmly. "He turned violent, and I had to protect her. Things got messy." Sterling stared at the brass letter opener, then back at the jagged red line on Silas's neck. The explanation was paper-thin. Everyone in the building knew exactly what had transpired. But Sterling was a pragmatist. He knew Bumpy was handed him a narrative that allowed the police to close the case without a mountain of paperwork or a neighborhood revolt. "I see," Sterling said, his voice slow and deliberate. And you are positive that is how it went down? Without a doubt, Bumpy replied. Sterling turned toward Bumpy's wife. Can you verify your husband's version of events? She didn't blink. That is exactly what happened, Captain. Silas grabbed that blade from my desk and lunged. My husband stepped in to save my life. I'm just grateful he made it in time. Sterling nodded to his subordinates. You heard the lady. Miller tried to kill her with a weapon. Mr. Johnson acted in self-defense. Get this man to the local clinic and have them stitch him up. Once he's stable, call the authorities in Mississippi. Tell them their death row fugitive is ready for pickup. The two patrolmen grabbed Silas by his arms and hauled him toward the exit. Silas was weeping now, a mix of agony and the terrifying realization that he was only alive because Bumpy Johnson had allowed it. As they dragged him past, Bumpy leaned in, his voice a whisper intended only for the prisoner. Silas, you have maybe 90 days left before they strap you into that chair, Bumpy said. And every morning when you look in the mirror and see that scar, you're going to remember Harlem. You're going to remember that you came here thinking your hate made you a giant, and you met someone who showed you what true power is. You'll remember that all those years in your hate group, all those nights feeling superior, were nothing but a fairy tale. And when the executioner finally pulls the lever, your very last thought will be about the man in the charcoal suit who was faster than your hate. They dragged Silas out into the glaring sun of the afternoon. The crowd of 200 broke into a roar of applause. It wasn't a cry for blood, it was a sigh of relief. One of their own was coming home. Bumpy had fulfilled his role as the neighborhood's guardian. Inside the quiet of the shop, Bumpy turned to his wife, his eyes softening as he finally looked at her. Are you truly all right? Did that man lay a hand on you? Bumpy asked, his voice thick with concern. I'm fine, she whispered, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I warned him he was making a fatal error. Bumpy let out a short, dry chuckle. I have no doubt you did. He pulled her close, burying his face in her shoulder. They stood there in the wreckage of the shop for a long moment, letting the heart-pounding tension of the last 4 hours finally drain away. He allowed himself to feel the fear he had pushed aside while walking through the police line. People are going to ask questions, Bumpy, she said softly into his chest. Sterling isn't blind. Anyone can see a dull brass blade didn't leave a mark that clean. It doesn't matter what they suspect, Bumpy replied, stepping back to look at her. It only matters what goes in the official log. Sterling has been taking my envelopes for 15 years. He's not about to find a conscience today. The wound is nasty, but it's a professional cut. It'll heal. Silas will stay alive long enough for Mississippi to finish their job. That's the only outcome anyone cares about. And if he talks, if he tells the guards or the press what you did. Bumpy's grin was cold. Who is going to take the word of a tattooed fugitive over a respected businessman? If he tells them a man in a tailor-made suit moved faster than he could pull a trigger, they'll just think he's making up excuses for being a coward. They'll laugh him all the way to the chair. She shook her head, though her eyes remained warm. One of these days, Ellsworth, your luck is going to fail you. Perhaps, he conceded. But not this afternoon. The events of March 14, 1948, became a permanent part of Harlem folklore. Over the decades, the tale grew. In some versions, Bumpy kicked the door so hard it flew across the room. In others, the crowd was said to be thousands strong, standing in total, eerie silence. But the heart of the story never changed. It was a story about an arrogant man who thought his hate made him powerful, only to realize he had wandered into a world where he was nothing. Silas Miller was extradited back to Mississippi the following morning. Before the state troopers arrived to chain him up, doctors at the local clinic had to put 22 stitches into his neck. The wound closed over the next month, but the scar it left was jagged and thick, a permanent white rope across his throat. Every single morning, as he stood before the rusted mirrors in the prison washroom at the state penitentiary, that scar reminded him of the lesson he had learned in the North. 3 months later, as the state of Mississippi prepared to carry out his sentence, Silas didn't fight. He just sat in the cold metal chair, his fingers tracing the mark on his neck, thinking of the man in the charcoal suit and the woman who had warned him he was making a terrible mistake. The fellow inmates on death row often pried, asking how he got the mark. Silas would spin a different web of lies every time. He claimed he was injured during the getaway, or that he snagged himself on a jagged window frame, or even that he had fought off a group of guards. He never breathed a word of the truth. He couldn't bring himself to say, "I threatened the wife of a kingpin, and he spared me just so I could die in this chair." Admitting the truth meant admitting he was a coward. It meant acknowledging that every lesson of supremacy he'd been fed was a hollow lie. It meant facing the fact that he went into Harlem looking for a victim and instead met a man who defined true strength. On June 20, 1948, at 1 minute past midnight, Silas Miller was executed in the Mississippi electric chair. He was 26 years old. For his final meal, he requested fried catfish, collard greens, and a slice of pecan pie. When asked for his last words, he remained silent. The officers who escorted him to the chamber later noted that as they tightened the leather straps, Silas kept stroking the thick scar on his throat, lost in thought. One guard whispered, "Is that where they got you during the hunt?" Silas looked up with a hollow smile and said, "No, that's where I finally got an education. I just wish I'd graduated sooner." Then the black hood was lowered, and Silas Miller departed the world haunted by a spring afternoon in a boutique where he had picked the wrong fight. Bumpy Johnson never saw the inside of a courtroom for that day's work. Captain Sterling's official filing stated that the fugitive had lunged at the shopkeeper with a sharp brass instrument, and that Mr. Johnson had utilized necessary force to neutralize the threat. Not a single person disputed the account. Not the officers, who had been conveniently out of sight. Not the hundreds of neighbors, who lived by a code of silence. And certainly not Silas, who knew the truth would only make him look like a failure. As for the boutique, it was open for business the very next morning. The only clue that anything had changed was the front entrance. Bumpy had destroyed the original door so thoroughly that it took a local craftsman 3 days to install a new one. Aside from that, life returned to normal, though the shop was busier than it had ever been. Folks didn't just come to browse the latest fashions, they came to check her pulse. They stopped by to tell her they were part of that wall of 200 on the sidewalk, to express their relief that she was unharmed, and to offer a helping hand with the repairs. She thanked every single one of them. She thanked them for being her eyes and ears, for being the witnesses, and for being the kind of neighborhood that stood shoulder to shoulder. Because when you peel back the layers of violence and drama, that's what this story is truly about. It's about a community that refuses to be intimidated. It's about the fact that when an outsider tries to bring harm to their door, the entire block answers the call. That sense of safety didn't just come from one man with a blade, it came from 200 neighbors saying, "Not on our watch." It came from officers who knew when to let the neighborhood handle its own, and from the unwritten laws that governed the pavement, the biggest one being that you never, ever cross a man's family. Silas Miller failed 3 times. His first 2 errors landed him on death row, but his third mistake simply made the wait feel like an eternity. He spent his final 93 days in a small cell, the mark on his neck serving as a constant reminder that hate is a weak shield and a pistol is no match for true authority. He finally saw through the lies he'd been told for nearly a decade, that he was superior, and that he was untouchable. The reality was much simpler. In that city, in that year, Bumpy Johnson had the heart of the community behind him. That is why he was the king. That is why his wife could look a desperate gunman in the eye and tell him he'd already lost. Even today, 70 years later, the elders on those streets still share the legend of the outsider who learned the hard way. You might walk into that neighborhood, but if you bring disrespect, you won't leave the same person, if you leave at all. If this account moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button immediately. We are diving deep into the chapters of Bumpy Johnson's life that the history books are too afraid to print. The moments when the guardian of the streets showed the world the true meaning of power. Give us a like if you think Bumpy showed a surprising amount of mercy by letting that man live to see the chair. And tell us in the comments, do you think Silas Miller truly learned his lesson, or did he go to his grave clinging to his old delusions? Don't miss tomorrow's video at noon. We're covering the legendary moment Bumpy walked into a high-stakes meeting with the Italian mob completely unarmed and walked out with the keys to the city. Remember, respect isn't a gift, it's a wage. And in his world, Bumpy Johnson worked for it every single day.